All right, so this video, we're going to do some retopology. And I'm going to show you a bunch of little tricks that might actually help you out during the retopo process, especially if you're not using like a dedicated retopo add-on or anything like that. So here we're looking at a voxel sculpt that I've created. We want to retopo it because obviously it's too dense. And we might want to clean up some of the geometry and make it cleaner and nicer looking as well. And so we can do that during the retopo process, or after we've done a little bit of retopo, we can go back and make things a little bit nicer. Now, most of you already know how to get started with the basic idea of retopology. I've talked about it a lot on the channel, but let me kind of recover that here real quick. So first things first, if you have the 3D cursor over here, if you press Shift A and create a plane, the origin point for that plane is going to be over here. Now, the origin point for the object is actually pretty important. So you want to create the same origin point, basically. Select the object, Shift S, cursor to selected, get the 3D cursor over there, Shift A, create plane. And it should be in the center of the object. It's going to work out best for you, all right? This plane, we can tab and go into edit mode. We can select it, turn on snapping, face project snapping, align rotation to target, and back face culling, all right? And now what we can do is we can press S and we can scale and we can move. And if we hit Alt Z, we can turn that on and off, right? You'll see that we can actually move it around and it snaps to the surface here. It's a little hard to see right now, but basically it's going to be on the surface, all right, with the snapping on. Now, to make it a little bit easier to see, we can turn on the retopology shading over here, okay? And so we can actually do that. We can tweak this number here if we want to make it a little bit more visible, kind of acts like it raises above the surface, right? Now, also, the shading on it might be a little bit hard to see sometimes. You can go to Preferences, you can go to your theme, right? And under your theme, 3D viewport, you can see here, let me kind of go back through that. So themes, 3D viewport, there's face retopology here. You can adjust this if needed, right? The alpha amount is the transparency, and you can change the color, all right? So then you can set it up to whatever color you want if you needed to. So now we can get in here and we use our edit mesh tools. We can extrude edges. We can pull vertices around and press G and move them around and whatnot, right? And they're going to snap automatically because we have snapping on. All right, they snap to that surface for the most part. Okay, now there's a little trick to this one though, and that is that when we're snapping with this, if we came over here and we hit G and move it, it snaps to this surface over here, all right? That's not always the behavior you want, and it can actually really destroy your work very quickly, and you can do it by accident without knowing, because it happens on things like loop cuts possibly and stuff like that. So here's the trick. There's also a face nearest that we can utilize, okay? This doesn't do that. It goes to the nearest face that it's presented to. So in this case, these are the nearest face over here, right? So it won't actually do that with this setup, but it's going to behave a little bit differently when working with this. And sometimes it's hard to get it to snap in the correct positions, but you might consider toggling back and forth between the two different snapping methods, okay? Very easy to mess up in the one, and the other one doesn't always quite snap exactly where you want it. You can start to feel like a weird delay, or it jumps around and does some weird things like this, right? So there's definitely a choice here. You can use both. Now, a lot of times when you're doing retopo, it's better to keep it kind of simple at first, right? So if you're doing hard surface things in particular, if you can do them in little separate parts and pieces, that's great. But you want to kind of keep them simple without holding edges right away. You want to start prepping the mesh to do all your bevels and holding edges and loop cuts and everything else you need to make it a real nice looking hard surface mesh perhaps. But you kind of keep it simple at first because it's just going to speed up the retopo process. Then you're going to spend a little bit of extra time making sure that you can work out all the little issues that you run into as you're retopoing. But this is the basic idea of retopo. It's just working in edit mode. And it's just face snapping. And it's nothing really crazier than that. You're just taking a dirty mesh and you're trying to make it a little bit cleaner, right? So there's some cool tricks with this though. You can see we can't see these very well. We can also adjust this, bring it out to the right a little bit. You can hold shift while dragging and make it a little bit slower. And we can press E and extrude whole patches like this if we needed to. But we can also grab like a vertex, for example, and we can control right click and we could just lay in some verts like this perhaps. And if we wanted to do the same over here, we can match the amount of vertices. This will work. Now we can control click, shift click, control E, bridge edge loops. Our normals might come in backwards. This happens quite regularly. So I have backface culling on. You may want to, like a lot of guys use the face orientation setup. I don't particularly like that one because of obvious reasons. But if they come in backwards, you Alt in, flip them. That's the easiest way to correct it, all right? You Alt in, flip your normals, you'll be good to go. So now we can just press G and move around, and we're golden here. Now, there's an add-on, it's in extensions you might want to pick up, It's a very simple one. It's called the F2 add-on. Okay, install it. It's going to be basically, there's maybe a number of different ways it could work, but the best one probably being is you select a single vertex, you press F, and it's going to create another vertex. Okay, so in these kinds of corners like this, it typically works out pretty well just to get a new vertex placed out or a new quad. It actually works out quite well. So we can do this all day long now. Like we can just go through this whole process, and this is the way I've typically shown it on the channel, just using this setup, right? It's really not that crazy. Now, this is where things are going to get a little bit more interesting, I think, because there's some tweaks or some different tools and settings you can use to make your life a little bit easier when doing Retopo. And it might make it a little bit more challenging if you're not real familiar with some of these tools, but we're going to get into it. All right. So first one's first. A lot of times you want to be able to do a like auto merging, right? So auto merge is up here under options, and we can turn it on. All right. And the default value is 0.01. All right. It might work out okay, fine for you. And something like this we can do as well, where we can Shift D and duplicate an edge. Right. So we can Shift D, duplicate an edge, grab two edges, press F, and we can do that. Okay. But sometimes auto merge doesn't work out the way you want it to. Because if we took like this vertex out, I'm trying to run into a situation where we can actually utilize it. Let's try this. All right. Let's say we extrude this edge and we click over here. You see it didn't merge. That number is too small, and it's going to not really snap there. It's not going to merge very well. Okay. So here's the thing. We want to increase the value of the auto merge to something that's reasonable for our project, but you're going to have to tweak this value depending on the size of your object. The main thing here, though, is that if we try like 0.1 and we start snapping now, like you can see it's going to snap. And we can kind of test this between two vertices. So like if they're farther apart, you scale them smaller, boom, you see it already snapping. That's a pretty big jump. We don't want that. So if we want, we could type in 0.01, right? And try this again. You can see maybe about right there we want it to merge, but it's way too small now, right? Okay, so let's try 0.0, I don't know, 0.03. Let's try that. See when it starts merging here. Okay, that's pretty good. That's not too bad. This is kind of the cool thing about it, because now you can just drop that there, boom. And if you're within tolerance, it's going to merge. So great. Now we don't have to do a bunch of manual merging all the time, which is awesome. And we can just keep working on the project and not focus on that as much as we need to. But a lot of guys, they wanted me to do a video on the Polyquill add-on, and I really like the Polyquill add-on. The only problem with it is that it's still very buggy. And originally when I tried it out some years ago, it was kind of buggy. And even today, it's a little bit buggy, right? So it hasn't had that fixed just yet, especially with the newer Blender updates. I believe the devs are aware of it. They're trying to fix it, but it might take some time. Who knows? Now, here's the thing. We can mimic kind of the Polyquill add-on to some degree by using the Poly Build tool, because we can click and drag out edges this way. This is just something to consider doing. You can also hold Shift and delete them, okay? You can consider doing this if you wanted to. Personally, I find it easier just to hit the E key. And then the other option to use that is that, or the other thing that this tool does is it lets you grab the vertices and move them around as well. So like you can just kind of drag them out, do this, and do this all day basically if you need to, right? So it's very simple and straightforward, kind of a fun way of working with topology anyways. Now, you could use that if you want. I was just pointing it out. And it has some options for it. You can long hover over this or like hover over it for a little while. You can see like you got extrude with left mouse, control left mouse, adds geometry by moving the cursor closest to an element or whatever. So you can create quads this way. Okay. I personally don't think it works out that well, but if you wanted to, you could. It's not quite Polyquill. It's not like Retopo Flow 4 or anything like that, but it's definitely something that, maybe you can consider using. Who knows? All right. So cool little trick with that tool, but limited in use maybe. And we can do a little bit better. So here's what we're going to do now. If you didn't notice, these became toggled on for whatever reason, two of them at the same time. You can't actually turn all of these on at the same time, but let me go over this first. I usually use the select box. I think this is very useful when modeling, but we can use the tweak tool. The tweak tool will let us grab verts and move them around and nudge them around basically, okay? So this is something we could do. What's fun about this is we can hold shift and we can select all the different modes. So vertex, edge, and face, and we can right click, we see our context menu's been updated. However, now we can select center, we'll get faces. Center of an edge, we'll get an edge, obviously. And a vertex, we'll get a vertex, right? So this is really good because now we can just extrude. If we want to take a vertex and extrude, you see where we're going with this? If I select this edge now, I can just hit F. I don't have to go through and select a bunch of verts and do all kinds of weird stuff. So once you get the hang of this, it's really quite good because you can just go through and just pretty much do what you got to do and rotate and scale and then grab an edge and press F. And this will speed you up quite a bit. You know, it's really quite good. So something to think about using. If you haven't done so, you can try setting it up in this manner. So now we got auto merge on, we got the tweak tool going, and we got all those selections going like so. So we don't have to constantly jump in and out of vertex and edit mode and all that other fun stuff. There will be still times that you might have to, and then it kind of messes up that whole workflow. However, a lot of times you can get away without actually doing it. So like if you can just scale things now to the center, you see where we're going with that? Like if I select this vertex and I hit F, I can just move it back. I can do that. What if I wanted to dissolve this edge here and I said dissolve edge? Okay, that worked. So you're probably going to use the, instead of like Control X all the time, you're probably going to use these options in here. So you could do limited dissolve or dissolve edges or vertices or faces or whatever. And then don't forget, you can also do collapsing. So collapsing can be quite useful sometimes when you mess things up, whenever you're optimizing mesh as well. But basically, like say we add a loop cut, we extrude out, and let's say we had something like this going on where, I don't know, we had a couple edges in here. And we can go through and select these edges, and we can X and we can collapse edges. Whoops, sorry. That did not work out the way I thought it was going to. Let's try this again. Maybe it's having a little bit of an issue right now, because we have the selection on everything, basically, you see. If it was just edge selection, you can X and collapse edges, okay? That's all I was trying to show there. You could do that. Unfortunately, when you have all three of them on, it does not work that way. So yeah, sometimes you do have to jump out of that and go back and use it the way you're typically used to using it. All right. All right, so last but not least, what else can we do to make our retopo job a little bit easier here? Well, the real trick comes down to this, is that there's no easy cheater way of retopology, I think. You can try like quad remesher, but it's not going to work out on a lot of things, especially things like this. It just does not understand what's going on with the mesh, and it's going to have a hard time. So here's the thing. You're going to go around, you're going to spend some time doing this, put on some music, try to enjoy it. And it's, at the end of the day, it's still subdivision modeling. There's no way to get around that fact. So you're going to spend your time doing this, but if you can work in little sections and parts, so if you can split your model into multiple pieces, a lot of times it works out much easier, right? So you can see I'm not doing these crevices because at some point I'm just going to turn all of this off. I'm not going to look at this mesh anymore as if I'm doing retopo. I'm going to be looking at it as if I'm actually just doing regular modeling work, right? So you can use these meshes as guide meshes, but they don't replace the idea that you're still subdivision modeling. You're still creating hard surfaces. You still need holding edges, and you need to prep accordingly and learn how to do subdivision modeling in order to get kind of good at doing the retopo. Now, you can learn quite a bit about subdivision by doing retopo as well. So it's back and forth. You can do one or the other. Play with like block out shapes and low poly models and turn them into subdivision mesh. Can help you out quite a bit. But you can also, you know, you can sculpt something really crazy and then try to retopo it and see if you can get the geometry to work out here well enough for you anyways in your project. As you can see, I'm going to run into a lot of issues with this one very fast, potentially. And I'll have to work all this out, right? Now, all that out of the way, the last but not least method of making this a little bit easier is the shrink wrap. So shrink wrap has, it's kind of like a double-edged knife or sword or something. If you add a shrink wrap, you pick the object, it will shrink wrap to it, okay? In edit mode, you won't see it. You can turn it on in edit mode if you really wanted to. But you see how it shifts things around slightly? This can be a little bit of a problem sometimes, but it's not, it can happen, okay? Sometimes it's not the behavior that you want on certain surfaces, but it is something you want on other surfaces. So the idea here that is you use vertex groups, okay? So you can see like Shrinkwrap right now is doing all this damage with this piece, just moving it alone, right? Why is it acting so crazy? Because it's on an edit mode, okay? If I Alt Z, you can see where we're actually moving and where it's shrink wrapping to is not the same thing. And also I'm not snapping. So you got to be careful of things like that. It's real easy to run into issues with Retopo and with the vanilla tools anyways. So you do got to pay attention to those. But let's say I'm doing an area like this and I'm going to shrink wrap it, or I want to shrink wrap it. But it's going to mess up. Let's say shrink wrap starts messing up all my edges that I've meticulously laid out and I really wanted, right? But I wanted to have this all shrink wrapped a little bit, right? So we can use vertex groups. Let me just create some mesh here real quick. We'll get it going. You can see I've lost my setup here with all those on. Anyways, so we do some loop cuts maybe. Now, if we want to snap these to the surface, we just press G and left click, and it'll snap those to the surface, okay? But if we're going to shrink wrap this, you can see, I don't even know how it shrink wraps like that exactly, but okay, it's shrink wrapping like that. Here's the thing. I only want this to shrink wrap, right? This area. So we select it. Control G, assign a vertex group. All right. You don't know what happened? The object data panel here. You can see there's a vertex group. We can assign or unassign vertices to this group. So for our modifier, we can set the vertex group. All right. And you'll see here, we can also toggle it back and forth. Okay. So that inverts the selection basically. So you can see all these ones are moving around right now, and I don't really like that, right? So basically, it's hard to tell what's going on sometimes even. And this one, when we turn on end result for whatever reason, looks like it flips the normals. All right. That's new. I haven't seen that before. I wonder if we just flip them, if it'll be fun. I guess it will. So we'll flip the normals back around. All right, yeah, but a little bit hard to read perhaps what's going on here. But the main thing is that when we have this on, this is the one shrink wrapping now, okay? On and off. Okay, keep it off in edit mode. Don't use it in edit mode. And so we can flip it though, so that all these ones take effect, or only this one takes effect. You see where we're going with that? Okay, so now, kind of that's a bad example maybe, but I had to go through that because what we're going to find is that we can go through this whole process here and we can start just working and going crazy with things if needed. But it's a little bit manual, right? Like you got to kind of go through and tweak the settings and adjust things, and it can be a little bit annoying. But I wanted to go through this whole process of Retopo because a lot of guys don't realize this, but like you can sculpt things that are extremely crazy, right? Like a lot of detail going on them and all that fun stuff, which happens, right? And you can get away with a triangle every now and then as well. But the main thing is that in order to turn kind of like a dirty looking sculpt into like a clean model is not as simple or straightforward as you think it is, especially like these hard edges. You can do all the big patch areas very easily, but you have to add all those holding edges in. And if you did use a shrink wrap and you had, let's turn that off real quick. If you were using a shrink wrap and it started snapping everything everywhere, you're going to run into an issue with that, obviously, for obvious reasons, because you don't want that behavior. So you can preserve some of these edges at least, and you can move some things manually later on, and you don't run into as many issues by actually telling it which things you want to shrink wrap, right? But this process is going to just continue at this point, and we can keep working with it, okay? It's really not that crazy once you get into it, and you understand a little bit of subdivision modeling. It'll help a lot. But like things like this, like what do we do in this area? This is the questions you're going to start having when you're doing Retopo. Like, how do you work these different geometries out? How do you make them work correctly and look good? When do you add holding edges in, which is usually, you could do it during the process technically, but it's a lot of times better to add them in later on, not right away. And if you're using the other face near setting, it can get really kind of weird in some of these areas, okay? When you're like extruding faces out and moving them around and whatnot. So, but you can see like we might need like a little thing here. We didn't quite sculpt it correctly, maybe. And this is where you have to start making judgment calls on if you ignore the snapping or you ignore shrink wraps as well, right? So in my case, I know if I just hit G and hold control, I can pull this down a little. This is the kind of stuff that's really going to start setting up your hard surface retopos to be a little bit nicer. Very easy to mess up and accidentally re-snap this thing out to the surface. So do be careful with that. But you can see, yeah, we'll switch back to this one for now. All right. This is what's going to ultimately matter the most, is that if you can get proper edge flows going, if you can create nice clean geo, even when you're watching some of the best 3D modelers out there, and they're in ZBrush and they're going crazy and they make this really awesome sculpt, you'll see that a lot of times they're using basically more or less quad remesher to some degree, right? Inside of ZBrush. It's called Z remesher. I believe it was made by the same guy, but I might be mistaken about that. So anyways, that tool inside of ZBrush doesn't always deliver like the absolute most pristine remeshes, right? And so a lot of times artists will actually take that remesh, and what they'll do is they will go back and they'll clean it up, which is more or less just manual retopo, right? And then they're going to create like a subdivision mesh, and they'll continue sculpting on that subdivision mesh to get a really nice end result, basically. That's the main idea. So you can see how this is going to start working out here, basically. Instead of, it's kind of like you're working in ZBrush. Instead of using a quad remesher or Z remesher, excuse me, all you're doing is you're just using manual retopo, okay? You would have to clean that thing up probably anyways, the Z remesh. Not always, but maybe there's a chance you would. And as a result, it still takes a long time, even in ZBrush, to make really great looking stuff for hard surface sculpts, right? Same is true in Blender. It's not an easy thing. It's not something you can rush too fast. It takes a lot of skill, a lot of practice, but it doesn't have to be as hard as you think it does. That's the main thing I'm trying to drive home here. It's like, this is all of the tools you need for the most part to start Retopo. Besides, you know, your typical edit mesh tools, right? Like all the things you would do, maybe you bridge edge loops or something too. Who knows? There's also like, you want to edge completely lined up, or, you know, you can use like loop tools and relax in this process, right? Like you can do some relax, you can do spacing. There's all fun stuff that you can use with all your edit mesh tools, which this video isn't about. It's not about basic modeling and all that, but with the tweak tool though going, and Shrinkwrap and everything else, this is the best you can do when it comes to Retopo without something like the Retopo flow add-on, perhaps, right? And even then, I think a lot of that tends to be very manual still as well. So it's not like a requirement for Retopo. It's just a kind of like a creature comfort, a little bit of a luxury to do Retopo, right? Cool little add-ons out there, sure. But learning the fundamentals like this first, just like how to actually do it, I think is super important. And so even though I usually kind of gloss over this a little bit when I do my videos, I'm always just like turn on face project and start snapping to the surface, turn on retopo shading. And I don't even use the shrink wrap half the time. There are times I'm going to use the shrink wrap. And you can use it in actually kind of crazy ways where you have like multiple shrink wraps going and all kinds of other fun stuff. But that's a lot of setup, and that's for like bigger projects usually. If you're doing like maybe a whole aircraft or something, you might need multiple shrink wraps. You might need multiple vertex groups, things like that. That kind of stuff can pop up. So, but it all starts right here. That's all I was trying to explain in this video. You see, we start laying out some edges and try to figure out what's going on here and how we might work with it. Like we know something needs to happen. We got this like N-gon shape going on, right? Let's pull it out like this and see if we can't combine these two. And so now we end up with something like that. Maybe just do that. Okay, so you got to kind of find the balance to things. I don't think this is quite the topo we need here. I think we need to have like an edge that goes through like this instead. So maybe we do something like that. Who knows? But now we got a weird triangle over here. Not really the best thing necessarily. And so we can either double up the edge over here and put another edge going down or whatever the case. But you want to try to keep it simple, like I was saying. You know, add what you need to, but don't add anything extra, basically, right? We could, yeah, we could do all kinds of things here as far as like topo layout goes. Ooh, I thought that was going to work better. That did not work out the way I thought it was going to. It absolutely did not. Let's run this one down. This is kind of a holding edge. Sometimes you still got to add them randomly. It's a weird thing, but some weird topo stuff going on here that it's not working for me. And you'll have to solve this stuff, guys. Like it's really that simple. Like, you know, it's yeah, I think the extra edge is our only option at this point. Going out this way. So like you'll have to solve things and get it working the way, you know, your model needs it to work, basically. With the right amount of density. You got to remember when you have like really sharp corners and they're on things like cylinders and curves, you see that snapping now? I think that's not, I don't like that snapping like that at all. I think that's too close. Let's try changing that. And we'll go down to 0.02 now in case. And so, yeah. So you got to tweak that value a little bit sometimes. The F2 add-on, though, save you a little bit of trouble for things like that. Yeah, so just keep going at it. Try doing it as best as you can. There's cool little tricks, right, that you can pull off. Like this can be down here to the back of a triangle. And then this here can all be F to filled. Dissolve that. And so this is still a quad technically. You don't always have to turn a triangle into a quad like that, where it has a pole at the back that's an end pole. But you can do that for sure if you need to. A lot of balancing and just estimating of, you know, like where things go. And we can still control right-click things, obviously, as well. If you control right-click well enough, it'll actually merge them as well, which is kind of cool. Maybe we can pull that into that area somehow and then maybe pull these down. And keeping them in little separate chunks like this, like especially if you have like really defined panels, which is really nice, because that way, you know, as long as they match close enough and you're creating like a high poly to bake or something, maybe just trying to clean up the model, that would work out pretty well. See, if I had a loop cut here, you see how it goes on the backside and I click, it snaps. Oh, maybe it doesn't today. A lot of times what it will do is it will snap to the front here. Yeah, see, it did it that time. I don't know why I didn't do it last time. This is when you switch, right? You loop cut. You don't have to move it. You can right click and it should snap a little bit better now. Okay. So it's a little bit tricky. You know, if your object's not super, you know, you don't have a lot of hard edges in it, you could get away with using face nearest probably for most of it. Okay. In my case, I don't really get away with it. So I have to do it this way, where I'm toggling back and forth basically. All right. All right. So once you get to this point, a lot of times you're going to find that, let's say I'm going to do a symmetrize with mesh machine. So Alt X, actually we'll do the vanilla Blender one. Press A, select everything. We're going to symmetrize. We can do positive X and negative X, and we can do something like this. Okay. So sometimes when you're working with this, and it may happen to you, but you might try to move something and it snaps to like these faces over here. Especially if you're in isolated mode, right? Sometimes I go to isolation mode so I don't snap to nothing. So you / to do local view or isolation. But like if I move this, it might snap to itself, you see? This is a little tricky. You can disable that by going to where it says include active. You can turn that off because this is our active element and we're in edit mode with it, right? So it won't do that no more, all right? That's all I'm trying to point out there. These options do matter. And this is include edited, right? So non-active objects in edit mode. You probably want that one on, actually. Most of these you want on. This is usually the one you turn off. So anything that's not selectable, though, like you can definitely turn that off as well if needed. So that's something you can utilize. All right. But yeah, so basically we're going to a center point And we don't have to necessarily even worry about this if we're using a, use my select box real quick. Let me see if I can get a hold of this thing correctly. Right. You can hold Alt while orbiting to jump in the side views. But basically down the middle here, okay, you can use cursor selector with C, mouse wheel up and down, left click selects, middle click deselects, all right? Right click gets out of it. Now X and delete. You only need, I feel like I'm deleting too much here right now on the front. I am. You only need to do half of this model, so you can do like SX and 0 and just slide it over a little bit on the half. Alt Z if you need to, because that's pretty much what happened there. I didn't get all of it. But basically, you don't have to do anything more than this. You can just use a mirror modifier. If you had the good origin point, you could just use its own origin point. Otherwise, you sample the object that you want to mirror across, okay? And you set up bisect if you go across the symmetry. So basically, these edges here, start snapping off a sec. If we pull them over, you can see like that. Bisect just cuts it in half, basically, okay? You can flip it if needed as well. And this is what we're trying to do for Retopo, all right? Because at this point, if you have good edge flows, you've kind of planned out everything you're going to do here, you should be able to start tightening some of this up as well. You can see auto merge at this point might mess it up a little bit, right? So careful with that. You can turn it off by just disabling it for a sec. But if you have good edge flows, you should be able to get in here and start making this happen like this. And occasionally you're still going to have to do reductions or redirects and things like that. But for like this piece here, you know, like this whole thing, we could solidify it perhaps, or we could try extruding it perhaps as well. It's up to us. So a lot of times you can split these into separate parts, you know, and that's very easy to do, by the way. You just go into edit mode, hit A, P. If you have gaps between your objects, you just separate by loose parts. And so now you're golden. So now we can do this. We can just, instead of maybe doing that, we can use the Solidify modifier, right? So these are options available to us where we do things like this. And at some point, sooner or later, you know, all of this will be applied more than likely. Maybe not the mirror necessarily right away, but the Solidify. Now we get to work this a little bit further. We can add some extra loop cuts. We could do some extra pieces like this, maybe. Hit E and F and make loop cuts even and flip which side it's even with. And so this can be quite good. Because you might have all, you can do insets and hold control. And so now this will subdivide. And now it's going to start looking like a lot of the stuff you've seen in time-lapse videos out there that guys have been creating, where it's going to start looking right, basically. Doesn't mean it'll be perfect. You may have to go through here and start working things out very deliberately in all kinds of different ways, because you can't always get away with solidifies in Blender. Sometimes you can't. But for the most part, you can see, like, if you didn't do good topology, you get little weird issues here or there. This needs more edges, perhaps, you know, in order to keep that kind of from falling apart. So now that I've done that here, it flattens all the surfaces out because we're not using shrink wraps anymore. So really, you have to know what you're doing with the Retopo to some degree and prepping it so that you can do additional edits like this, perhaps. Unless you do it while retopoing, in which case you're going to be working a little bit harder. And it might not come out looking as good because the mesh will be more dense. And if it's shrink wrapping especially, you're going to start picking up all the deformations and the weird stuff from the original sculpt, right? So what you're doing when you do these sculpts is you're using them as like a modeling guide or an aid. You're not actually using that as the model, right? You're going to retopo it in one shape, way, or form or another. So in the case of just snapping to the surface, this is what we end up doing, right? In the case of this big cylindrical piece down here, it's not really modeled as a cylindrical piece and it looks off, right? I got to remodel this. And I would do that with a cylinder, subdivision workflow, doing it kind of straight out, right? The way I would typically work with subdivision. Whereas like all this other stuff, I can quickly kind of retopo real quick and have at least base shapes going so that I can continue working with them with subdivision modeling. You get where I'm going with this? That is how you start to create really spicy models, all right? Because it's very hard to just work with subdivision from the start and get the correct kind of shapes and forms going. Not saying you can't. There's plenty of people that do. But it's very hard, especially as a beginner. And this is going to help kind of alleviate some of that stress. So we know what we're trying to create now. We just have to make it and make it better, okay? That's the whole reason I wanted to retap on this video and go back over all this, because it's a little bit of like a back and forth method. Even if you're doing like a model with like Boolean Ngon workflow and whatever else, right? There's no reason that you can't at any time take any mesh that you're working with and start to lay out topo on top of it and do a retopo of it, right? It can be quite useful, especially for like complex intersections or whatever the case. It doesn't have to be a full sculpt like this necessarily. It's just a type of work, a way of working. And in our case, it's just a way of working with snapping for the most part, or possibly a little bit of shrink wrap involved, but it's nothing more than that. And this is why a lot of guys struggle with this, I think, is because, I mean, you watch a lot of videos out there, I'm sure, on all the different kinds of, you can take multiple objects into edit mode, by the way, if you wanted to. But you've seen a lot of videos out there talking about retopo, and they kind of glaze it, make it look really simple for more organic kind of things. And organics get a little bit more complicated as well, because you need like specific edge flows and topology for deformation and whatnot. But for hard surface, it's different. It's not quite the same thing here in Blender, right? So like real far back in the day anyways, right? We didn't have all the remeshers that we have today. We didn't have all the fun different methods of snapping, and it was a little bit more basic, right? But a lot of times, like, you could still create a mesh and model around a mesh was an idea that a lot of guys use. So they'd create really nasty, dirty topology and mesh, and they would use it more as an art piece or like a concept piece, and then they would try to make that more proper later on. And it always became a situation where, like, when you're trying to come up with your own designs or your own concepts or whatever, it's really hard to work with polygons and keep them clean while coming up with a design. But it's actually a little bit like, it's easier to go back and kind of like respice it up later on or rebuild it after you got like a dirty topology model. And so you'd find a lot of guys, they would do kind of like booleans and they'd go crazy. They'd make a dirty mesh and then it'd come back and snap to the faces or verts or whatever and create a new mesh on top of it. That's always the way it's been. That's the way Retopo has worked. And for particularly like sculpted meshes, right? At one time, like, you know, there was no remeshers and stuff, and we didn't have like voxel systems that worked really well, perhaps. And a lot of times you had to take quad subdivision mesh into your sculpting program just to add more detail. I mean, that's the way a lot of times it worked out. So you needed some kind of like basic subdivision mesh, and subdivision wasn't standard yet either. It was like different ways that different programs handled subdivision. Now it's all like based off open subdiv. So Pixar kind of standardized that for the most part. And, but that was like the classic workflow for sculpting to begin with. You modeled it, you made it subdividable, you took it into your software, and you continue to work on it basically. And if you had bad poles and bad edge flows and topology, and it didn't subdivide well, you wouldn't get very clean sculpts with that software. So Blender kind of works in kind of an older fashion in that sense, right? Because it has a lot of cool built-in tools. We have voxel remeshing, obviously, but we don't work that way all the time. On some objects, you still might do that, but a lot of times you can start with voxels and retopo. Okay, and that's all I wanted to show in this video, was that this is in fact possible. You can absolutely sculpt a monstrosity very fast, and it takes almost no time at all to start once you get used to sculpting in Blender to start doing stuff like this. But you can retopo is going to take you longer, generally speaking, and I'm not even lying about that. To get all this to look just right, broken into parts and panels, and create a proper subdivision mesh out of all of it, it's going to take longer than the sculpting process. And that's kind of the key there, because you don't want to get into this situation where it's like, what came first, the chicken or the egg, the concept or the model, right? You want to get your ideas out of your head as efficiently as possible, and then be able to start working them into a production model. That's really the main idea, right? If you're doing your own designs, especially, or if you are doing your own designs anyways. So with all of that out of the way, hopefully this helps you out a little bit, right? Some of you guys that have had questions from me about, you know, all kinds of various different things when it comes to modeling and hard surface. And this will help get you to that next level. I promise you. Start learning to sculpt. You can use Boolean Ngon in the process. There's nothing wrong with it. You don't have to do everything as a sculpt. You can also just, you know, Boolean Ngon, standard model, whatever the case. Use subdivision mesh in this process as well. Nothing wrong with that. But you can eventually get to this point, you're creating just really crazy designs. You have to kind of work on it for a little while. You have to think about what you're doing. You have to think about the design fundamentals and art fundamentals and, you know, what are interesting, cool shapes and forms and all that fun stuff and silhouettes. So there's a whole nother ballpark there to explore when creating something. But you use all these tools in Blender to just create the things you want to create, right? And then the Retopo process is how you start cleaning it up, is more or less what's going to happen for you. So you just continue working on this until you're absolutely, satisfied with the kind of results that you're getting. It won't be a big deal. Oh, one last thing here I want to mention. When we're using face nearest, this one has like kind of an interesting way that it snaps sometimes. So let me see if we can get this to actually work, because it was moving kind of weird over there. Face nearest does something interesting, which is, you see here, like I can back it up. And when I pull it down here, it stops at the edge for the most part. Okay. So at glancing angles, or when it starts hitting back facing, or the silhouette basically, right, it stops moving. So this is actually really cool, because you can do this to line up the edges very quickly if you wanted to. You just kind of view them from the back a little bit, and you push it down. You see? Blam. And we got it just like that. If we had done that over here, it would continue moving down. You see? So it's a cool little trick that you might utilize. And I'm finding myself to like that one a lot. So, and it should work on other things a little bit, maybe. Depending on how you're looking at it, maybe it works better or not. But yeah, it might work on other like concave areas perhaps, but definitely on these convex corners at a glancing angle, it does not want to go over those edges. And it's just angle based, I think, is what's going on here, right? So it's not like the depth of anything really matters. It's just the angle. So like, even though this is kind of like a narrow little area, so like if we just moved it, you'd expect that behavior. But if we hit it from this corner here, like you can see, yeah, we can just line up right on it, which is really cool in my opinion, that we can actually get that behavior out of Blender now. So I don't remember when they added this type of snapping, but it wasn't too long ago, I don't think. It was maybe a year or two, maybe. I don't know. I hardly, if ever, used it, and I never realized that it actually worked that way on the edges. But now that I do, you always learn something new about Blender, right? Like you could be using it for years, and you'll still learn new things about it. It's amazing how that works. Every update, they're pushing something new out. Sometimes they're more useful than others, but it's honestly, it's hard to keep track and update with this tool, because every time they do a new release, they might say like there's a bunch of features that come out, and then they never talk about those features ever again unless you look in the manual, right? So not everybody's utilizing them possibly, or know about them even. It's like kind of like what Epic does with Unreal Engine. They're like, oh, we added all this cool stuff, and then nobody talks about it for years, and all this stuff that everybody relied off of for making games, they don't ever talk about it ever anymore, like just the basics, because they're too busy talking about all the new stuff, right? That's usually what happens. So it's hard to keep track of things, and this is where having a group of guys that are really dedicated to working on 3D models or games or whatever you're trying to do is super useful to keep in touch with, because like you might have a question, they might have an answer, right? And that can happen. So you can see I turned snapping off entirely, because I would probably go back through and in certain situations, I would very carefully just start reworking all this, just to make sure it's right. Because I still have to add details in here at some point, obviously, right? And so this would be a new base mesh that eventually I crank up in detail, possibly later on. Now, I wouldn't do it this way. I would more than likely, a lot of these, I would end up doing a subdivision with keep corners. Oops, sorry. Subdivision with keep corners. Okay. And I would probably apply a level or two of subdivision, depending on how much detail I need. And I would do something like that. And then this would be my new base mesh. So that would be kind of the trick with that one. And you can see if you had a bunch of holding edges and you start doing that, it's going to become a little bit more problematic perhaps. So you got to find these balances and these workflows. You got to really think about what you're doing and how you're going to work with your tools, especially as you're trying to push the envelope of becoming, one of the best 3D modelers out there. So that's something you're going to spend a good chunk of your time on, is just learning all these things. And you can learn them pretty quick, believe it or not. But you do have to spend the time doing it. Like, it's not going to do itself. So just keep that in mind. Like, you're going to have to spend more time in Blender than you're probably ready to know about, because it's what's going to happen. All right. It's going to eat up a lot of your free time, basically, for years, mind you. It does take years to actually get good at doing everything that you've ever probably wanted to do. If you're trying to design things and create 3D models and create games, and it takes years and years of learning to really master it all. But the basics of modeling, like subdivision modeling, practice first. Doing low poly meshes, blockouts, turning them into subdivision meshes, if you can. Working with booleans in that process, of course. Practice that stuff. Try to get good at modeling faster, right? I know a lot of guys tend to get hung up on it, struggle with it. That's the whole reason I started this channel anyways, is because there's people that have so many questions about just modeling different things. Try to master that as fast as you can, because honestly, you still have to deal with, creating UV maps and materials, high to low bakes. So you're going to have to do rigging, animating, possibly working with like scripting inside of a game engine if you're going to go work with game art. And you got to work with all kinds of other fun stuff too. So like using Vertex colors to drive like swaying branches of trees and stuff like that. Maybe you end up doing a bunch of stuff like that, right? So you might be doing environment pieces and blocking out levels and doing level design. Especially if you're on an indie project, you tend to be like a generalist overall. You tend to do a lot of different things. So, and you don't always have all the tools the pros have, and so you don't always get to use those workflows you always see people talking about necessarily. Like if you were to look up some like how they made Arc Raiders videos, you're going to realize very carefully, or quickly anyways, that you don't have all the tools that the guys had that made Arc Raiders. They got like a little automated Houdini process. There's a lot of studios that you go through Houdini, and they do like an automated setup between like different programs. So it'll run a little bit of Blender, maybe it might run a little bit of, or like Blender might be the base of everything, and it executes through Houdini, and then it turns on like Substance Designer, and it runs all this Substance Designer stuff, and it gets crazy, man. So AAA game art has a lot of systems to it, no doubt. We're not all going to have that at our disposal, unfortunately. So you're going to stick with like the tried and true methods, the older school stuff. And Retopo is one of those old school tried and true methods right there, right? So hopefully this, I mean, I'll talk about a lot more than just Retopo, but hopefully it answers some questions you might have had, give you some things to look forward to as you start modeling more and more, and getting better and better at what you do. You'll have fun with it at some point. You'll see sculpting and 3D modeling as more of like a pencil and less as a complicated tool, right? And then you can actually just get in and start working on things and create whatever you're thinking of in your head, or you can imagine. And that's when you know you've kind of got to that level, that when you start feeling like you're no longer like treading water, right? Like you feel like a fish in water. That's when you know you're getting at that point where, you know, you're going to be a very valuable person, possibly at a studio at some point, right? When you're getting to that mindset that you're just looking at these as tools to do a job and do a thing, and you move on, you rinse and repeat, and you do the same thing again on something different, you know? So hopefully this video helps you out some way. If you did enjoy it, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, all that fun stuff, and I'll check you out in the next one. All right.